Cassandra, what did we know about Truganini before you began to write your book?
Well, I think a hell of a lot of people thought they knew something about Truganini, or they recognised the name, and I was trading on that kind of name recognition across Australia, that people wouldn't see this necessarily as just a Tasmanian story. And basically, they often weren't quite sure what they knew about her, but if they knew anything, it was because she was the last, you know, it's all that lasting stuff. And that was the thing that I was really setting out to dispel. That what I wanted to talk about was a woman who deserved to be famous for what she did and how she lived, and not simply that she died. And so I think that people have picked up the book. It's got a very pick-upable cover, as you commented, but picked up the book because there's a bit of name recognition, and there's also a sense of here's a bit of truth-telling. Here's a story about the past that I need to know. I think I know something, and probably I don't. And so my sense is that that's gone a long way to that people realise whatever they know about Truganini probably isn't what they should know, or what they rightly know is right about her. And so that's worked very well, actually, because she is terrific. You know, she's you can tell, you know, I think she's wonderful. She's delightful. She's wonderful. And that sense of being able to, within the limits of what a non-Indigenous writer can do, yeah. And the fact that my only access to her is through the eyes of a sort of very self-serving, paternalistic colonist, or more than one, but one in particular. There is a sense that I am trying to make this woman live, and I'm, you know, encouraging Indigenous actors, playwrights, filmmakers to take it from there, really, because she needs to I believe that she would be a wonderful subject for an imaginative presentation.
That's interesting. She'd have to be given some room to, and it'd be a very modern story. I wasn't going to ask you this, but of course she takes her sexuality, which is early on. I can't believe what happens to this woman before she's 25. And very early on, she understands what she needs to do to use the exploitation of her sexuality, and she actually sort of owns it in a very tragic way for most of her life.
Well, I'm not sure that it's tragic. I think that, you know, we've got a strange attitude to transactional sex, which, you know, as somebody who's worked in African-American slavery and in Native American exploitation of Native American and other Indigenous cultures, I think that what we're seeing here is kind of part of the whole process, and that sexuality isn't necessarily seen through the same lens of Victorian England, and that her transactional relationships with white men, which starts at a very young age, is part and parcel of the world that she's growing into, and that it is in almost every colonial encounter. And I think that I know that some readers, particularly some members of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, here are a little anxious about my discussion of her sexuality and the issues of syphilis. But, you know, don't be so squirmish. There's no reason to be so concerned about this. This is part of the world. I mean, syphilis was so widespread at that time. You know, all these white women had it as well. You know, it's not something strange that, you know, stigmatizing Aboriginal women, and likewise those kinds of transactional relationships between women who don't have very much power in the relationship and the men who do. We don't need to, you know, the issues of race don't even necessarily need to come into that. That's just how life was in the 19th century, in the 18th century, the 17th century, the 16th century. And so, you know, this backward looking that somehow we need to start tut-tutting about transactional sexual relationships between Indigenous women and white men is a misunderstanding. I mean, she has a lot of power in those relationships, as far as I can see. She certainly does use that kind of sexual power to allow her to, and also other skills that she's got, to allow her to live as close as possible to the life that she would want to live, right up until the time she dies, which is pretty spectacular, really, given the extraordinary apocalyptic change that has overwhelmed her people and her place.
It's, you use the word apocalypse on the cover and during the book. Back in, I looked up the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and in 1967, okay, it's a long time ago, but they wrote about the successful rationing of Aboriginals on Bruny Island, and it began in May 1828, which is your story, and induced the government to advertise next March for a steady man of good character to effect an intercourse with the natives. I know, unfortunate. Robinson believed, and this is George Augustus Robinson, who's a big player. His diaries you rely on a lot for a primary source. Robinson believed that conciliation was possible, applied for the position and was appointed. There's no mention of Truganini in the entries. So what actually happened, Cassandra?
Well, it is true that he applied for the job, which, given that he was quite successful in Hobart as a builder, is curious. But, you know, hello, dog. He's an evangelical Christian. This is the most important thing about him, apart from his desire to better himself and his family and climb up the greasy pole of the colonial elite, all of which he does very successfully. But, you know, he sees himself as God's messenger, and that he can bring these poor benighted people to God and thereby save them. And so he believes that. And, you know, I know enough about Christians to understand that they do believe that. And so you know, you got to give him a bit of slack, and that he believes that God will look after these people. And it was heartbreaking for him that he didn't, and that, you know, God would actually allow all these people to die. But nevertheless, he's fairly steadfast in his desire to bring them to God, and that's why he goes there. But it doesn't take him very long to understand that these people are going to be a rare resource for him. And so all the way through the narrative, what you've got is this contradiction between his desire to save them and protect them from white violence and to keep them from becoming extinct, with the realization that as an extinct people, they will be valuable to him. And that removing them from Tasmania will make him money and will make people take him seriously in a way that they don't take him seriously when he's just a tradesman who you know, gives out rations to black people. So that's fascinating, really. I mean, it's difficult to pull yourself away from Robinson because he is so fascinating, and concentrating. And what I'm trying to do, of course, is just look through his eyes at the people he's looking at without paying too much attention to what's going on in his life. It is difficult to separate one from the other, and especially Truganini and Wireddi, her husband, because they're so closely associated with him. They're so intimately associated with him, which is why we know so much about them. But also, you know, there is this problem that Robinson looms very much too large in some respects in the narrative, but it's the only narrative we've got, really. Otherwise, you're in the realms of fiction, and with no basis for it, and it's not somewhere where I'm inclined to go anyway.
Yeah, I have to laugh and let our watchers know that to hear Cassandra Pybus say, you've got to cut him a bit of slack, and then remembering in the book the way you write about George Augustus Robinson, which is, there's a wonderful tension in the whole book about you controlling anger. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, it is. And I don't always, I mean, I sometimes would ask myself the question, can I allow this amount of authorial intervention here? And for example, that terrible, terrible story on the West Coast where he rounds up the very last of the people and puts them in that prison on Macquarie Harbour where they all die. You know, I can't not make a kind of authorial intervention into that narrative and say this is in, you know, in all of his subterfuge, in all of his, in his lying, and this is the worst thing. This is the worst. I just can't control that. And you can see just even talking about it, it just enrages me because these people were living a perfectly good life. You know, they may have, you know, they probably could never have not been impacted by a pandemic disease any more than we can not be affected by it right now. But pandemic disease doesn't entirely wipe out communities. It, you know, smallpox didn't wipe out the Native American community in America. It made big impacts, but they still continued on. And those people on the West Coast would have done because nobody was interested in being on the West Coast. It was too wild, it was too everything, as it still is, let's face it. But he could see that if he could get rid of everybody from Tasmania, then he would be so richly rewarded. He actually says that in his diaries. And so even though he knew what he was doing to them, and that how he had to use guns to get them to go with him, no persuasion there. That was like, you know, point your guns at them and make them march, and then put them in a prison. And it's just shocking. I mean, it's not my job to get into into alternative realities, but it is quite clear to me, and it was to, you know, Linda Ryan, who came before me, that the original people, the First Nations of Tasmania, could have survived on the West Coast and would have done, were it not for Robinson's intervention, because nobody else was making that intervention. That was him. And he did it in order to be rewarded, in order to be made a great fuss of, and indeed a great fuss was made of him. And he got lots of land grants and lots of silver and lots of money. And yes, and the rest is history. You know?
How well should we know the term the black line? Explain to me what that, explain to people what that is.
Well, people know the black line more than they know most things about Tasmania, and it's funny because it was such a ridiculous failed thing. But basically the idea was that every able-bodied white man, be they convicts or free settlers or soldiers, would marshal at either end of the island and march in long formations towards each other, supposedly pushing the First Nations that remained, the clans that remained between them, and then they would push them all down onto the Tasman Peninsula where Port Arthur is now, wasn't then, and then ship them off to somewhere, anywhere. I mean, all the settlers were interested in was getting rid of them. The word they used was extirpation, which you may know, but not everybody knows, is an old English word that means to eradicate. And it's usually, by the mid-19th century, it's being applied to vermin, rats, wolves, extirpate. And so basically how it was done, you know, the governor didn't want them just being poisoned and shot. And so his idea was that, and he's an evangelical Christian too. So his idea is, you know, round them up and you take them off to somewhere else.
I keep seeing the, you know, the beating for the hunt.
You know, that was it. They really were going to have a great time. And, you know, Robinson comes through after them and you can see what they've done. They've cut down all the trees to make their huts. And, you know, the gentlemen have got, with their convict servants, made themselves huts, and they've got table and chairs, and, you know, they've got the trappings of an elegant life, and you know, they just think they're on this wonderful excursion, And of course, they're in a country that they don't know and understand. It's very rugged, and they don't manage to catch anybody. The story is that they caught an old man and a boy, but it turns out, on my research, that they'd actually commandeered the old man and they had the boy with him as guides.
I'm laughing, but I'm not really, because, and I think the moment when your anger is beautifully controlled, because maybe we should is finally when Truganini's bones are on show and then not on show. But tell us first, please, about your family connection to this story.
Well, my family arrived in 1829 and immediately were granted over 2,000 hectares of land on Bruny Island, which is Truganini's traditional country, at a time that she and her father and other members of her family were still living there. And so they settled there and started to make a farm with their free convict labour. And they would see her and her you know, other members of her clan walking across their land, and right, as they understood it. And they would give them tea and sugar, which is what they were craving for, and flour maybe. And they observed how they hunted, and they observed how she would dive for shellfish and crayfish. And all of this is recorded many years later by a British collector who was collecting stories about the first people. And then by the end of 1829, they were all gone. Robinson had taken the last 4, Truganini were ready, and worried his 2 children away. And so then they had Bruny Island all to themselves until much later, when she was on at the Aboriginal station at Oyster Cove, just across the water from Bruny Island, still part of her territory. And she would go over to Bruny Island all the time, and once again would wander across the Pybus property and would be given handouts. And, you know, so the Pybuses were very proud of the fact that they, you know, knew Truganini and that they were kind to her and that they let her walk across their property. Now, I only found that out like many years later, because I discovered that their neighbour, George Augustus Robinson, had written this long journal, and it had been published and I could read it, and I was just like, whoa, you know. So there was that sense of my own family's complicity, but more than that, there was this extraordinary narrative about travelling around and around Tasmania with these Aboriginal peoples, whom the most prominent, or the 2 most prominent, were Truganini and Muridi. And so that was this like fantastic story. So that story has been with me the whole time I've been living in Tasmania, since I came back here in my mid-30s. And I wrote about it in my first book, Community of Thieves, from a point of view of the settler class, that is my family and George Augustus Robinson. And this time I realised that I needed to reverse the lens, turn the lens around, and consider much more than I did in my first book, although I did in my first book, my responsibility. You know, that the way I put it in my book is that I had to tell a story of the people whose lives were extinguished to make way for mine.
Mm. Yeah, you say at one point that you don't want to rely on secondary sources, that you want to stick to the primary sources, and that's the diary is very important. But it seems to me there must have been, and it's a formidable effort, result of a history. It's an amazing thing. There must have been gaps though, Cassandra. Because we. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, gaps.
So how did you fill them?
Well, often by, for one period of time, you've got Robinson is just endlessly scribbling. You know, he's just an amazing scribbler. And so when he's not looking at her, he's looking at somebody else. And so that my book is also a book about her companions, who are significant players in this story too. And so that I know that she's with them, and I know that she's doing what they're doing. And so there's a sense that when the narrative will shift to Mulboyhina or Pive or Yumara, or the big chief, Manalagena. But it's still her story, and I do make that point very clearly, that this is a kind of although these people come from different clans, they have made their own kind of communion with each other, and they're deeply connected to each other, and so that her story is their story too. So there's that. And then luckily the time in Victoria is quite well, they go to Victoria with George Augustus Robinson in 1839. And that time is very well documented in the press because of the murder that takes place, but also because there's opposition to these Tasmanians being in Port Phillip, and there's opposition to Robinson being in Port Phillip. And so there's more coverage of what is going on in the press, in the Port Phillip newspapers, because they loathe George Augustus Robinson and they write about him quite a bit. So again, there's more source material there than you might expect, actually. And then of course there's the whole trial and all of the material that's around that to go on. And
they were understanding a lot, weren't they, at that stage? These people that we've assumed were illiterate, I mean, culturally illiterate, were clearly understanding. Well, I think from reading your book, I get a sense that they were watching, understanding, and doing the best they could with what cards they were dealt. Yeah.
They from the word go, that's apparent to me, that they see Robinson as their best chance. And why wouldn't they? I mean, he loves being out in the Tasmanian wilderness. He spends most of his time in Tasmania from the time that he comes to our attention, not in Hobart, but out in the bush with a bunch of Aboriginal people on whom he is completely dependent, and you know, the colonial term that's used for this is going native, and he does. I mean, you know, he tends their corroborees, he dances with them, he plays his flute, he goes hunting with them. He doesn't take off his clothes like they do, but basically, to their way of looking at it, you know, this is a reciprocal relationship. And when he's out in the bush, he is in the process of becoming them. And what they perhaps a little less, it takes them a while to get to understand. And when they do understand, their relationship with him changes fundamentally, is that reciprocal relationship is not the way he sees it at all. And that once he's not in the bush with them and not dependent on them, immediately he reverts to the idea that these are these hapless savages who have to be taught how to live, taught to be Christians, made not to dance, not to put ochre on their bodies, not to speak in their language. And this is a dreadful betrayal of them, and they never forgive him for it.
So interesting, Cassandra, to get the imposition of cultural values on a people by people whose cultural values were so brutish and I mean, not good for them. They were, you know, the sealers. My goodness me! I mean, what these men were brutalised and brutal people, and to have us believe for so many years, for centuries, that that white colonial culture was bringing something enlightened. Your book really underlines for me how, and you're smiling because I think people must be telling you this quite a bit.
Well, yes, I think that one of the things that writing this book has done for me is kind of finally clarify that issue about genocide. It is very clear, and people say, you know, wouldn't they do this, and weren't they nice people and stuff? I say, well, Robinson's the best you're going to get. That's the first thing. And secondly, the Settle project in Tasmania was very clear. They wanted these people gone, right? And once they were gone, once they were physically gone from Tasmania, then they basically didn't want to have to pay for them. Even though the money, the small amount of money that they were to try and keep, minimally keep them alive on Flinders Island, came out of a grant, came out of the land fund. The land fund was the the land that they'd taken, that they were then selling freehold title to people, and that was what made, so, you know, sell their land, make the land. Then they decided they wanted to use the land fund to pay free white people to come to Tasmania, so they wouldn't be dependent on the ex-convict community. And so they wanted the money for things like that, and they didn't want to have to spend it on these savages who weren't very good at turning into freehold. It would never make freehold title anyway, wouldn't make farmers, they couldn't even grow potatoes. And they refused to become Christians. They kept sneaking off and having their, you know, vile ceremonies. And so the idea was that you just made it worse and worse for them. And you could count on the influenza every year carrying them off and so forth. And so you just sat and waited until they died. They were so eager for them to die. They make no bones about it. The newspapers are full of it. And then you wait and dig up their bodies and start trading in their bones. Now, if that's not a genocidal project, I don't know what genocide would be.
Bringing these people back into history in a way that that gives them as much voice, because we do get some of their words from things that were reported, so we've got that firsthand. But you did find a few things, didn't you? For instance, you fixed up who the portraits were of the people who we normally.
Actually, Gay Sculthorpe, who's the curator of Oceania for the British Museum, sorted that one. I mean, I went there and she invited me to have a look at the drawings, and at first I was quite shocked because I thought, oh no, you know, I got so used to that pretty full-faced girl being Truganini. But then she showed me, you know, first of all, what the collector who bought them from Robinson had written, that Robinson had told him about the portraits, the woman with the shell necklace is Truganini. And then she took the frame off it, and written on the back of it was, "This is Truganini." So, right, you know, it's pretty clear. And therefore, and as soon as I really started to look at her, I thought, yeah, that's her, that is her. You know, she's exhausted, she's tired, she's had a really hard time by the time that painting has been done, because she's been having to do an enormous amount of hard work on those trips. She's the one who has to swim them across the rivers, you know, push these huge rafts loaded with men and dogs and food and all the rest of it. She has to swim behind them and push them across these wild rivers. I mean, and it's dangerous, difficult work. And so by the time they're back in Hobart and that Bock has them sit for him for those paintings, Robinson wants them for his book he's going to publish about them, she's exhausted, and she looks exhausted. And so I realised, yes, that is her, actually. Yes. Took me a while. There's some pushback about that claim that's because the other portrait that has been said to be her is so perfect for a postcard, the museum postcard. I think the museum doesn't really want to give it up because it's a perfect postcard.
Gotcha. You make a lovely thing that comes through it too is the necklaces, the polished shells too. So, and I've very much got her image now of this very beautiful, very she does sound quite amazing, Cassandra. You must have begun to be overwhelmed by what a life this is.
I am. I mean, as a historian of colonial experience in various places, not just Australia, I recognise that for a woman in a colonial setting to live to be 70 is a pretty amazing achievement. Even the elite women didn't do that very readily. I mean, it's an old for a woman in Victorian England. And so for her, this woman who's had this really hard physical life, who's been a prisoner of the state for a very long time, who has clearly even if it's in its latent stages, suffered from various kinds of venereal disease, but carries syphilis. For her to live to be nearly 70 is astonishing. And what is even more astonishing is that she does it entirely on her own terms. I mean, she doesn't turn... What possible role could there be for a First Nations woman in colonial society in the mid to late 19th century? She'd be an unpaid servant.
She'd be a slave.
That's the word. That is the word, yes. But not this one. She didn't work for anybody, ever. I mean, when she's living with Mrs. Dandridge at the end of her life, because the government won't pay to have her staying down at Oyster Cove all by herself anymore, Mrs. Dandridge is being paid to look after her. Mrs. Dandridge is her servant. And she makes very few concessions to European life, despite the fact that they love to show these photographs of her in her, Victorian dresses, and she's always got her shell necklaces, you'll notice. But I think it's more telling that Mrs. Dandridge tells about how she never sleeps in the bed. She always sleeps on the floor, in front of the fire, surrounded by her dogs, plural, dogs, several dogs.
Yeah.
And this is in a house which is now a lovely house in Macquarie Street, I think, in Hobart, but elite house. And there she is, sleeping on the floor with her dogs. And these gentlemen who come to see her measure her up with their eyes for where they're going to put her skeleton. They in order to get her to give her some words of their language and to sing some songs to them, or whatever it is that they're trying to get from her, so they can scribble it down and use it to increase their status later on. They have to give us something. They understand that in order to get into her company, into her presence, her gentleman callers, as I call them, that they have to bring her Madeira wine or sweetmeats of some kind. She demands. It's the same when she's sitting for Bach. And the other artist she sits for, she demands in return for being able to paint her, take a photograph, copy down a song that she sings for them, or record, that they have to provide her with with what she wants, and usually what she wants is wine and cake, so basically she's always in control of the transaction, and she dies. The last thing she's heard to say when she dies is, she calls out, "Rajawara, catch me!" And I know what that means, because Robinson's recorded this time and time again. This is the sort of spirit who controls life and death, so that it's perfectly clear that she never becomes a Christian. She never goes to church. One of the things that's said about her when she dies is, can we give her a Christian burial? I mean, she's not a Christian, is she? And there's this, oh yeah, I think that, when the bishop went down to take their photographs, yeah, right, see what the bishop's interest is, to take photographs of them, he baptized them. Well, he didn't, as a matter of fact, he was just too busy taking their photograph to be interested in their spiritual well-being. And so, no, she wasn't Christian, but they gave her a Christian burial anyway, mostly because they wanted to protect her from being, because already the gentleman callers who'd been visiting her had requested her body, and so they had this secret burial for her, but they knew where she was buried and they dug her up anyway.
Yeah. Do you think there are more stories like this you'd like to find out about?
Well, I'm very interested in the whole story about the bones. I was, you would be astonished, horrified to know the extent of that. They dug up every grave they could find. As soon as people were dead, they got their bodies. It isn't just Truganini. It isn't just Truganini or William Lanny. There was hundreds of them. well, you know, hundreds of pieces, skulls, you know, parts of bodies, and a number of intact skeletons all around the world. They traded them. I saw the cast of Truganini skeleton in Victoria, in the Museum of Melbourne, alongside, or in the same day that I saw Parlap. In fact, in my mind, I had the two of them together. And it turns out that this cast of the skeleton was not removed until maybe 1970, 1969. It was still there for people to see. And the biggest thing that that museum has got is Tyrannosaurus Rex. And do you know how they got Tyrannosaurus Rex? They traded it for the cast of Truganini skeleton. So that's my next project. Tracking, you know, who went there. And I know these people. I've been researching them. I have a sense that these aren't just bones in cabinets, or not in cabinets, just like in the bowels of the buildings of museums. These are people who had real lives and had been desecrated in the most hideous way at a time that it was illegal and immoral to do so by people who were governors and colonial secretaries and the colonial elite, in fact, not just, you know, the scum of society.
Well, Cassandra Pybus, as Henry Reynolds says on the back of your book, it's as though Truganini found her, the biographer who was waiting. You know, you're a match made in history, I think. So well done, and we look forward to your next effort, which I'm sure will be just as rigorous and just as controlled in its emotional as that. Thank you enormously for Truganini. Thanks, Cassandra.
Well, thank you, Rosemary. Nice talking to you.
Indeed.